Hello, everyone, and welcome to the American Civil War and UK History channel on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Joining me today is Sarah Bierle. Um, so, who has worked for the Central Virginia Battlefield Trust for the last 1.5 years, but has also been involved in battlefield preservation for the past 13 years. So, Sarah, just tell us a bit about that, please.
Certainly. So I was interested in the American Civil War from a very young age and actually made my first donation toward battlefield preservation when I was 14 and have advocated for it ever since. It was really special, very exciting to be able to come on staff at Central Virginia Battlefields Trust and work on saving battlefield land here at Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, the Wilderness, and Spotsylvania Courthouse.
Cool. It's a big year for Central Virginia Battlefields Trust. You will be celebrating a big anniversary this year, as it's your 25th birthday. So happy birthday!
Yes.
Sarah has also written a book about the Battle of Newmarket for the Emerging Civil War series. So please tell us a little bit how you got involved with all this, please.
Certainly. So, my research on Newmarket is obviously a little different from working on the battlefield preservation here in Central Virginia, but it's all part of the same conflict. And I do like to refer to the Battle of Newmarket as the far extended flank of Lee's army in the Overland Campaign. So, I have a great interest in history of Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, and the opportunity came up to do a book for the Emerging Civil War series, and I quickly pitched the Battle of Newmarket. It's a conflict that's probably best known for the involvement of the Virginia Military Institute cadets. They filled a gap in the Confederate line and helped to secure a victory for General John C. Breckinridge. And so the book focuses on that as well as the other units, the battle. They're short chapters, easy to read, lots of pictures, notes if you have an opportunity to tour the battlefield site.
I did actually manage to tour it once, actually, in 2007. There's a I watched a little video and introduction about the battle, and there's a little house there where you can visit as well. Isn't it? I can't remember now. It's a little while ago now, but yeah, it was quite good. Anyway,
The Bush House there at Newmarket Battlefield.
yeah, that was. I really enjoyed that. Yeah, it's because it's called the was it the Field of Lost Shoes or something?
Yes, it is. It's called that since it was so muddy that day of the battle. The shoes were actually being pulled off the cadets and other soldiers' feet as they were moving across this big open field that has a particularly low area. One of the days that I was out there doing research was after a bunch of rain, and I can tell you the water still puddles out there. And the colleague I was working with that day, he was trying to dare me to go out there and see if my shoes would get pulled off, but I decided I probably would skip that experience.
Yeah, that would be a good idea. Okay, so now a couple of weeks ago, I saw a post on the Central Virginia Battlefields Trust Facebook page. And if you haven't liked the page yet, please go and find it. I will put links underneath on the descriptions afterwards. And it was about winter camps, which is something that's interested me for a little while. Obviously, being a reenactor, see, we're not brave enough to go and camp in the winter. I mean, it's a bit cold. We do sometimes go out in like sort of early in the year, but not that early. Yeah, so we're just going to first, obviously, we're going to talk about camp life in general. This is something that you've been studying for a little while now, isn't it?
I'm familiar with it from studying the lives of the soldiers and officers in the armies.
Okay. So, daily duties of camp life. Do you know any of that?
Absolutely. So, if we're talking about camp in a more permanent setting, as opposed to camp overnight when an army's on the march, there's going to be some things that would be the same in both positions. And I know we coordinated on a few notes here, so I'll list a few, and then maybe if you want to jump in and add more
Yeah,
information
I
as
can
we're
do that.
going along. So one of the things that is kind of interesting is revelry, or that early morning bugle call to wake everybody up, the 1860s alarm clock for the soldiers there. In the spring and summer months, it was usually at 5 a.m. But according to John Billings in Hardtack and Coffee, they moved it up an hour in the winter, so 6 a.m. And one thing that's important to note is you're going to work off the daylight as well. There's no daylight savings time in America during the Civil War period. So part of that's going to be how much sunlight do you have and how are you going to work within that time range. And then, of course, after you get everybody up, you have to get into formation for a roll call. Then you'll have surgeons call, things like that, to check on the health and numbers, if you will, of the particular unit.
Okay. And normally they have breakfast, don't they, at some point? And then what always made me laugh is there was a guy that spoke on the documentary, Ken Burns documentary, and he mentions breakfast was followed by drill, and then more drill, and then after that we had drill, and then after that more drill. So they love drill, don't they?
So, and then later in the day, they'd have their mid-meal, usually referred to as dinner in that time period. And then there might be more drill. But one thing that's important to note is units could be detailed, and this could go down to a squad or company level, or it might be a whole regiment or a brigade that's going to be detailed off to do some other duties, like maybe picketing. That was really important in the winter to keep the camp safe. Elisha Hunt Rhodes writes about being detailed with part of his regiment to go out and build roads, to try to build some transportation system through this mud and mire of a Virginia winter. Of course, there might be more drill if they were just stuck in camp. And then sometimes in the evening, there might be a dress parade or formation. That wouldn't always be practical in the winter, but certainly it was possible in some situations. And then in the evening, what have you researched and found out that they did?
Leisure time. Now, what sort of things were they doing? Cards, maybe, gambling, things like that, maybe.
Well, quite possibly. You weren't really supposed to be gambling in camp, but we all know it happened. And reading is another thing. Different agents with the U.S. Sanitary Commission or the U.S. Christian Commission actually reference in the winter of 1862 to 63 that soldiers were asking for things to read. So that might be literature, it might be religious tracts, newspapers, things like that. So you do have quite a few soldiers in the Army of the Potomac who are literate. The majority can read and do some form of writing. Writing letters would also be something that occupied their time. Many more letters were written than have survived in the archives. That was their form of communication. So the way we might grab our phone and send a text to see how someone's doing, or maybe write an email to tell them what we did in the day, or place a phone call, they're going to write letters to stay connected with friends, family, loved ones back home. So those are some things they might have done in the evenings. Also, you're going to have to keep gear in good condition. So that's going to be cleaning your gun, cleaning your accoutrements. If you're a cavalryman, you're going to have additional chores because you have to take care of your horse's gear as well. And then, finding ways to stay huddled and warm in the cold winter months.
Definitely. So the army didn't fight a lot in winter. One reason being roads are impassable most of the time. A couple of times they did during 1862 and 63. As some people know, there was a battle in Fredericksburg. In between that, there was a mud march, which we all know how that ended. And there was also in the west, there was a battle at Stones River, where you have the Confederates camp in Murfreesboro for a little while, for a time. So, they did camp for long periods. But during obviously this little period, sometimes they didn't. But in Virginia, there were lots of they were camped pretty much the whole year of the war, every throughout the war, wasn't they really?
So there were camps all across the fighting areas of Virginia, and every winter you have both armies, which will eventually be called the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia, Union and Confederate respectively there. They will go into some form of winter camp for every winter season. And so that's going to be your more permanent type camp for the Union Army. That's going to be Stafford in the winter of 62 to 63, out closer to Brandy Station, which is to the west, in 63, 64 around Petersburg in the final winter. And I guess I missed the first winter, so that's going to be up closer to Washington, D.C.
So really and truly, they was, you know, I mean, the Army of Potomac mainly camped most of the year round, didn't they, in Virginia area though, mostly. I mean, I know they moved around, but they would have. Is there actually any examples left still of some of those camps?
Yes, so there are the remains of winter camps. The camping that took place more in the campaigning season, so the spring, summer, and fall, that usually wasn't stationary quite as long. So it's not always as easy to find remains of those camps. Although some examples or locations are known and exist. But if we're focusing in here on the winter camps a little bit, yes, you can find remains and ruins of them. One area that's been preserved, and the effort was spearheaded by a gentleman named Glenn Trimmer and Friends of Stafford Civil War, I believe was the name of the group. And they have preserved over 40 acres of a camping site from the Army of the Potomac's 11th Corps, so units from that corps. They're not exactly sure which ones. They think perhaps New York regiments, because when they've done their archaeology studies and such, they found New York buttons and other symbols out there. So in fact, I was out at Stafford Civil War Park. It's now county held and preserved last weekend. And you can see depressions in the ground where this is where a hut would have been, or the stacked stones, the remains of chimneys and things like that. And that's the area that's been preserved. But just driving through Stafford County, if you know what you're looking for, you can see a lot of ruins of these camps and camping sites.
So that's really cool. So you can actually visit that site then. I'd like that.
Yes.
I might have to do that.
I would definitely recommend going to the county park if you want to be getting out and exploring. People don't take too kindly to strangers walking through their front yard to look at the camps. So go to the place that's been preserved.
Yeah. But yeah, so is there any differences between the winter and summer camps? Obviously, there's probably quite big differences.
Yes, so a winter camp is going to be much more permanent, generally speaking. So it's going to be somewhere where a unit, I'll go with the regiment level, a regiment's probably going to expect to stay there for several months, at least through the cold period. So let's say they go into winter camp in January, they're probably going to be there at least through the end of March, maybe even into April. We definitely see that in the winter of 62, 63, where you don't really have winter camps getting broken up until the mid to end of April as the Chancellorsville campaign begins. So a summer camp, summer's the campaigning season. So yes, guys are going to camp for the night, but it's going to be much less permanent and not as long in one place unless it's a siege or a fortification type scenario.
Okay. Of course, one of the biggest things about camp life was diseases in camp, and you know, some of them were horrendous. I mean, some big casualties, some big loss of life through diseases, wasn't there?
Yes.
What sort of diseases were we looking at?
So pretty much the types of diseases that Civil War soldiers are going to encounter throughout their soldiering time of life. So some of the things that were going to be even worse or compounded in the winter, it's going to be effects from the cold. So things you're not going to have frostbite in the middle of summer, but you could have that. There's accounts of guys going on picket duty and literally freezing to death, and that being a fear of guys going on picket. Some of the diseases encountered are going to be pneumonia, typhoid, dysentery. Malaria is not going to be as prominent in the winter because that's transmitted by mosquitoes. So that's more of a summer disease, unless a soldier has recurring malaria, which then he might go through a bout of it in the winter. Cholera, measles, particularly in newer formed regiments who haven't gone through that phase of everybody getting sick. And then you have guys in such close quarters that diseases are going to spread quickly. One thing that is important to always keep in mind is that more soldiers in the Civil War will die of disease than actually of bullets, shrapnel, or other effects from the actual battlefield. At least 3,500 Union soldiers died in the winter camps in Stafford County in the winter of 62 to 63. And one thing that I've been looking into a little bit and just considering is there's accounts of guys who are sharing huts, so messmates, friends that they've known from back home. They've enlisted with these guys, probably gone to school with them, helped in each other's shops and fields. And, there's accounts of my best friend died today. And so there is going to be a mental health toll on the personal side, not only dealing with the death in campaign and battle, but this death that is very close, actually, in your temporary cabin home in the winter period. So I think that's something that is always sobering, but important to keep in mind when talking about these things.
Yeah, and also there was a thing I read about lice.
Lice was a problem, but in Virginia, it tended to be a bigger issue in the summer. Lice are one of those insects that kind of die off when it's cold, like the mosquitoes. I found a quote from a Confederate soldier. He said he would much rather spend 6 winters in camp than 1 summer's march. And that's part of the complaining about the lice. And then a couple of weeks ago, I was reading some letters by Oliver Norton, who was a Union soldier, and he is very thankful that on the Gettysburg campaign, he has not got lice yet. Apparently, a whole bunch of his comrades in the same unit were dealing with the issue. But from what I've looked at so far, it doesn't seem to have been as bad in the winter because the little bugs die.
Oh, thank goodness for that.
A little break, right?
Yeah, horrible. So US Sanitary Commission was set up, wasn't it? When Joseph Hooker took over? I think he was a bit of a he didn't like the way things were in the camp, and they started looking at conditions of the camp and set about changing things. Obviously, at this point in time, they're learning a bit more about personal hygiene and staying clean and stuff like that, and also understanding diseases better and how they spread. So the US Sanitary Commission, that was set up during the Civil War, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And it was actually started in the first year of the war, 1861, if you've got any new viewers joining us, new to the topic. So the Sanitary Commission, it is supporting the troops from the North, so it's Union-based, and they sent agents into camps summer and winter, and they would go tell the officers, oh, this isn't clean. This isn't, a good setup for keeping your men healthy. And there was a lot of friction between the Sanitary Commission and the military for a number of periods or years because they would see it as civilians interfering with the military. And yet the Sanitary Commission would often show up after battles with supplies, food, medicines, bandages, these things that were desperately needed by the Army. So it was really important that the two entities, military, civilian, learn how to work together. And it is during General Joseph Hooker's first few weeks in command that he starts making efforts to pay better attention to the health conditions in the camp. He also wants to stop this desertions that are just draining the manpower out of his army. And so he does find ways to help improve the soldiers' lives as well.
Okay, so winter camps themselves. So I have got some examples here.
Great.
To bring up. Hopefully this works.
Sounds great.
So here we go. We've got
nice.
I think this is what you was talking about in Stafford with the lot. So this is a chimney, is it? The stack here, and
yes.
So is that how they would build their winter tents?
So that's one example, and different units would use different methods of construction for their winter quarters. The one that would be, I believe, on the left of the screen, hopefully it's showing that way for everyone who is watching it, the modern photograph. You can see that they've stacked up logs at the bottom, and then that's actually the tent shelter that they've put over the top. And yes, most tents, they'd come up with some way to have some sort of fire or maybe even a stove that would be more for the officers to help keep warm. So in this photograph, you can see they've stacked logs and then they've used mud and clay to plaster those logs so that they wouldn't just go up in flames. I think I can't quite tell in that original photograph, but there are original photographs out there where you'll also see that they've used barrels on top of the chimney to help build it up, because wood was running scarce in Virginia during the Civil War. And I know that can sound kind of strange to think about, but when you put hundreds of thousands of men on in two different armies in an area, they're going to start stripping the land of the wood. And that happened. There's accounts of this whole area of central Virginia. The landscape changed, not just because battles were fought there, but because trees are felled to build roads, to build camps, to get firewood just to stay warm. And some soldiers write about wood getting scarce in their areas. So they're not going to usually build like a full log cabin like we might imagine settlers in the American West building or seeing those instances, but they'll find ways to build like this. There's, well, I don't want to jump ahead. Did you have some other photographs?
No, that's fine. You carry on.
Oh, okay.
I was enjoying myself then.
Sometimes there's other sketches out there of them building these like lean-to shelters where it almost reminds me of pictures that we see in like Boy Scout or do your Boy Scouts in England? Yes. I don't know if I'm using the right term.
Yeah, we do. That's fine.
Okay. So, you know, like two uprights, a ridgepole, and then they're taking evergreen branches and piling them on. And there's sketches that Edwin Forbes did that show these what look like kind of flimsy shelters, and they're just covered with snow, which is going to be cold, but it might also help insulate just a little bit. And so part of it depends on the leadership that a regiment has. And I was reading about the 16th Michigan's winter camp, and they write that it was well laid out and it was well organized, and the shelters were adequate and they were able to stay warm. And the soldier reporting on this credited it to the untiring innovations and leadership of his regimental commanders. And I see there's some other photos up here on the screen, and the one on the top, the large one, is a great photo. You can see how there's those winter shelters on either side. There's room for wagons to come on in with supplies. It even looks like they've laid logs or some type of planking maybe over the ground, probably a form of a corduroy road, which would be felling trees across muddy roads so that supplies, men can move a little easier through there. I think in the lower photo, we might actually have a barrel on top of that chimney. Yes, it's a little blurry, a little hard to tell, but I think it is.
Yeah, it looks like it to me.
Yeah.
If they've done the cursor, that's where it is. That's, yeah.
So, and then just this afternoon, I was looking at some accounts, and it sounds like some units would also use the topography of their assigned camping area to their advantage. So if they had to camp on a hillside, the guys might partially burrow their shelter into the hillside so they didn't have to build as much. You'll find them making plasters out of clay and mud, filling in the chinking of the logs that are being used. They'll use straw to fill in the cracks at the bottom if they're camping in canvas. Until they can get a more permanent situation. So I think you mentioned that you do reenacting or living history. So just kind of think about ways that you would try to fill in the space at the bottom of your tent if you didn't have that sod cloth to try to stay warm until you could get a more permanent shelter built. And that's what they were doing. And the men's skills for the mud and the plastering, sometimes guys in the unit who'd worked as stonemasons or brickwork, they had skill on this is how we can put things together with mud so that it is a little more insulated and less drafty. So guys are going to be working together to make the situation as good as possible because they want to survive winter and live to fight another day, live to go home to their families and their occupations after the war.
Of course. And I think people seem to forget that, the army is that big and they take up such a massive area, and also
Yes.
I think people forget about the logistics behind an army. We always think of the battles, but we don't think of, it really interests me, the logistics behind an army. It's just mind boggling, isn't it, really, when you think about it? Really is.
And you think about so the Union Army in the winter of 62-63 can move supplies partially by water and by rail, but to actually get them into the camps, they're still relying on equestrian drawn conveyances of some sort. So it might be mules hauling, might be horses. I see some supply wagons maybe in that photo we were just looking at. But you have to remember that putting the animals into this type of conditions of mud, of almost constant wet rain, snow, that deteriorates their health. Those animals have to be fed, often with supplies that they are hauling. So it kind of becomes this equation of, okay, we brought in this much supplies, but they hauled this much forage just to feed the horses. So it's kind of this difficult logistical situation, and it improves after Joseph Hooker takes command, but they're still working on it in 1863, the Union Army. The Confederate Army is so hampered by the logistical problem that toward the end of the winter season, they actually send the First Corps, so Longstreet's Corps, Army of Northern Virginia, is sent away because they can't feed the army out of the land around Fredericksburg any longer. And that happens with several detachments of the Confederate cavalry as well. They're sent away because there's no more forage in the area. So absolutely, supplies and logistics are so important to look at.
And also for the local community, which is, they're using all of their stuff, aren't they? So they're going hungry as well, probably. It's horrible for them. Anyway, so okay, so keeping warm then. So they would have, some of them, like you're saying, would have had the fires to keep them warm in their cabins or their makeshift tents. Keeping dry, that must have been quite hard for them. Would they have done things like take their socks off at night and dry them and things like that?
Well, I think that's probably going to depend on the individual situation, and hopefully you had a dry pair of socks to put on so you could, take off that wet pair. Most Union soldiers are going to be issued winter clothing uniforms. So you'll see sketches, sometimes you'll even see them in paintings of the overcoats, things to keep warm. So those are going to be made out of wool, just like we do in our own winters, layer up, lots of layers. It's going to help keep warm. A lot of soldiers wrote about being wet. And we know that if you're wet and then it's really cold outside, that can be dangerous. You don't want to freeze, but you also don't want to get sick. And it's going to be hard to get warm. I mean, if we're in that situation in our modern times, we probably will be a little miserable until we get to home or our destination. But then we're going to be able to go into a nice warm building and get dried off. These guys are going into a warmer shelter, but it's not warm, but by what we would call warm in our own modern era. So a lot of guys write about being cold all the time and struggling to get dry or keep dry. One thing that is worth noting is they had what they would call, I think they called them ponchos. I think it's referenced in Hardtack and Coffee, and you might have more information on this, but it would be like this oil skin cloth that they could then put over, and it kind of acted like a rain gear, trying to keep some of that rain off.
Yeah, I know that had quite a multi-purpose use actually. I think that sort of that I think there's the poncho. I mean, we use it in reenacting, but it is used, and they even use it for gaming as well. They used to turn it over and draw a checkers board on it or something like that, similar to that.
Right.
And they would also use it for in the summer, obviously insulating the ground, maybe. So I think most of them were issued with that, but I think it was maybe a little bit later in the war. I'm not 100% sure on that. But yeah, they definitely had things like that. From what, because I've read Hardtack and Coffee as well, so yeah, I'm sure it's referenced in that. Anyway, so also, I mean, so sleeping, how many would normally sleep in a tent?
Well, there again, it's going to depend on how big they're making their winter shelter. It's going to depend on the unit, but usually you're going to have at least 4 guys living in these little shelters together at minimum. Again, some of it'll depend on how strong the unit is and how many huts they decide to build. But basically, no one is going to get a hut to themselves. So hopefully, you find a way to get along with your messmates, or at least find a way to tolerate them,
Yeah,
because
everyone likes
don't
you.
get your own bed either.
Yeah,
You're gonna get to share with everybody. So everybody put your blankets together, and
There
it's gonna be a sleepover.
So they were issued with blankets, wasn't they, as well?
Usually, yes.
Yeah. Anyway, so also then there's the boredom part of it. I mean, and missing family and loved ones. That must have been hard for a lot of these guys.
Right. And so they find ways to try to occupy their time and their minds when they're not out doing their duties, or in that day to day struggle to live, struggle to survive. So some of the things that I like to point out is, as I mentioned earlier, reading different forms of newspapers, literature, religious reading. Some men found their faith strengthened in the winter months. They would spend time going to prayer meetings, chapel calls, things like that. One thing that Joseph Hooker helped with as he took over command of the army was getting the mail and packages from home into the camps a little quicker. Excuse me. And that, of course, had a real boost to morale. And the support or lack of support from the home front, pardon me, is really important to always keep in mind. And one of the things that we see in soldiers' letters from this winter period of 62 to 63 is some are writing and saying, don't believe what you read in the newspapers. Don't buy into the Copperheadism, which was kind of this movement to negotiate peace with the South. And the army doesn't believe in that. Don't believe what the papers are saying. So there can be this disconnect, and you find soldiers writing home and saying, please tell me, basically, you're still supporting us. You've still got my back. So that was really important as well, just knowing that they were supported on the home front. And one thing that soldiers could look forward to, and I think this is important to point out, is furlough. So furloughs were kind of a mess when Ambrose Burnside was in command. But as Joseph Hooker came in and started trying to organize and standardize, he realized they had to get control of the furlough situation, because men needed to be able to go home and see their families, but it needed to be controlled so that the army knew where they were. So what he did was he basically standardized a 15-day furlough, and then sent out directions to the regiments on who could be going on furlough at certain times, things like that. He started putting some regulations on officer furloughs. So those officers couldn't just say, bye, I'm gonna, go spend winter at the hotel in Washington. So that was something that had a positive effect. And there again, we see it reflected in soldiers' journals and letters, next month I should be up for furlough. I can't wait to come home and see you all. And that can have a big effect on morale as well. Just knowing that they would get to see their loved ones, or, get a little break from the war in this winter camp was a good thing for them.
Was that a little bit different for the Confederates, maybe, the furlough system? I don't think they was allowed to do that, was they? Or was that similar for them?
I believe that there were furloughs. I'm not as familiar. I don't remember off the top of my head how that was working, but you definitely do have soldiers who are able to get furloughs. Not as easy for the officers. And then you've got some commanding generals who are just like, yeah, we're not giving out furloughs right now. But if they could find a way, and this would go for both armies, if they could find a way to make the furlough system work, then in theory, you wouldn't have as much of the desertion when the guy really does intend to come back later. You find some of that happening. I can think of some examples on the Confederate side where a guy would be like, I got to desert because my wife is sick and I need to go take care of her and the children. He intends to come back, but his officers won't give him a furlough. So then, of course, he's labeled a deserter, things like that.
Yeah, I've heard of lots of accounts like that as well, where the wife has been literally sent a letter to her husband in the Confederate Army saying, you've got to come home because we are destitute. We've got nowhere to live. We've got no food. And they're stuck between, fighting for their country or what they believe in, or deserting and going home, So that must have been a horrible decision for some of them guys to make. So anyway, well, there's a massive difference. We know this. The lower ranked men and obviously the officers. So, they are going to probably have a nicer time in the winter, aren't they? Especially the higher up ones.
Yes. So if you're a general, you're probably going to have winter quarters at a Southern civilian home that will be taken over to be used as headquarters. Colonels, other officers might do that as well. There's some good examples from Elisha Hunt Rhodes, who's a lieutenant in the 2nd Rhode Island Infantry. He writes about messing with his fellow officers. So they kind of build a nicer cabin all together. I believe he describes that they had a floor in it and they kind of built these what we would call bunk beds. So they had a nicer situation there. There's some accounts of Confederate officers spending the winter in tents, though. That would be some of Stonewall Jackson's staff. Jackson staying in an office at Moss Neck Plantation. He's out in an office building and his staff is under canvas for much of the winter. So it kind of depended on where you were and what resources were available to the regiment. One thing that I've noted is officers were usually warmer. So they might have the access to that camp stove or more fuel or more supplies in that sense. So if you want to have the better chance of staying warm in the winter, I would recommend promoting to officer if you're in the Civil War period.
Yeah, brilliant. So also, I know you touched on a little bit about supplies and that, but food for most men. So how easy was that, and what sort of food were they eating during the winter? Did it differ from the summer?
Well, in some ways it would, but in other ways it's going to be pretty standard. So assuming, and this would be a big assumption, that supply trains are able to move and your logistics system is working, then soldiers are going to be getting their standard rations. So that's going to be hardtack, beef or salt pork. For the Union Army, there's usually some rice and dried peas in there, coffee, sugar, salt, things like that. So just like when they were on the march, the guys are going to get issued their rations. They'll usually cook a lot of it together. They're kind of form that mess, put someone in charge of cooking, particularly if you're in winter camp. It's this guy's job to cook for all of us. We'll, give him all the rations and let him make something that's hopefully tasty and warm. One thing that would be a little easier in the winter situation is the sutlers would be able to get to the soldiers a bit easier. So these are going to be civilian traveling merchants, might be a good way to describe them, that are going to bring those extra niceties to the camp. And I actually marked a passage because once the soldiers in the Union Army are getting paid on a little bit more regular basis, then they have money to send back to their homes, but also to be able to supplement their diet a little bit more. So I know I keep coming back to him, but here he is again, Elisha Hunt Rhodes. He writes, "We pay big prices for things to eat. Butter is 60 cents per pound, cheese the same. Bread, 25 cents per loaf, soft crackers, 30 cents per pound. Cookies, which children and soldiers love, 3 cents a piece. Today, I found a small codfish at 16 cents per pound. It tasted good. Another thing to note is once Joseph Hooker comes in and is getting the supply system moving better for the Union Army, he's able to make sure that they get fresh meat. So that's going to be, they're actually bringing in live cattle and slaughtering them in the camps. They're also able to get raw vegetables. So imagine like potatoes, carrots, things like that. And then soft bread. So not the hardtack, but they're actually able to build ovens and bake fresh bread, similar to what we would have as like a wheat bread, probably. So that just having good food that's not hardtack, salt, pork, coffee can also be a big morale booster. It's also going to be something that's smells better cooking. It's going to cook for a while. You're going to be able to stay warm while even doing that cooking. So that's something that's helpful to note when we're talking about food in that winter period.
Yeah, so if you're static, you're probably eating better then, aren't you, really, in a way, I would imagine, with all that extra stuff coming in. Good man, Joseph Hooker, that's what I say. Didn't last very long, though, did he? Bless his heart.
Well, not with the Army of the Potomac. He really helped to reform the Army. I mean, he does structural reorganization, boosts the morale, builds that Army of the Potomac into the fighting machine that famously is going to hold the lines and win the battle at Gettysburg.
Yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
They lose at Chancellorsville, and Hooker is definitely part of that problem. But I think it's worth taking another look at his organizational leadership, and he did some really powerful things.
He did. Okay, so the men from the deep south never experienced cold weather before or even seen snow. I haven't seen snow for about 4 years. Only on your pictures that you took the other day. We're supposed to get a snowstorm tonight, but it probably won't. My kids have never seen snow.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, only on pictures. She keeps asking me, Daddy, when's it going to snow? I don't know. Sorry. Is it going to snow? No, sorry. Anyway, one day. Anyway, so yeah, what was this like for those guys coming from Georgia and Florida and Texas and places like that? They must have been thinking, crikey, you know?
Right. So we've crossed the river now, and we're at the Army of Northern Virginia, which was about 72,000 strong after the Battle of Fredericksburg, so in this winter period. And yeah, snow is exciting. It's this cold white stuff, and it sticks on the ground, and oh, we can squish it together and make snowballs.
Yeah.
And there's some great accounts out there. I'm sure you're familiar with some of them.
Yeah.
One of my favorites comes from Kershaw's brigade, and then the regiment of the 3rd South Carolina. And it's this account of Georgians and South Carolinians, and their officers have coordinated. In some ways, it reminds me a little bit of a reenactment battle because they've piled up these mounds of snowballs. I mean, they're ready. And at the appointed hour, the officers rally everybody and they go out and they have this big snowball fight. Well, it wasn't completely innocent all the time. And the officer who's writing this from the 3rd South Carolina, he said that if officers were caught, they could get quite the beating. And it might not all be in good fun. Another thing, and this seems to have gone for the enlisted men and the officers, if the opposing side captured them as prisoners, they would haul them behind the lines and start stuffing snow down their jacket and undershirt, which, oh, that's just going to be cold. Like, imagine dropping ice cubes.
I think I've experienced that before.
Exactly. It's like, oh, that would be really cold. There's another account, and I can't remember which soldier or unit this comes from, but so we'll go with it's a story that the Confederates thought it was really fun to throw snowballs at General Longstreet, and they would just pelt him with snowballs as he was riding through camp. Well, he finally made that a rule that you could throw as many snowballs as you wanted, but not at the general. So then it would happen that if he was coming through, you'd hear this order go down the line, hold your fire, the general's coming through. So there's some great stories that come out of that period.
Do you think anyone was brave enough to throw one at Robert E. Lee?
Oh, yeah, I'd like to know if someone did.
They must be very tempted.
I think they already had him in some form of reverence at that point, so I don't know if anyone would have attempted it.
No, they might have they might have got beaten up by their fellow colleagues. Yeah. Um, yeah. So I did hear one account, and again, I don't know whether it's I've heard it from Gary Gallagher actually. He
Okay.
he says in his lectures that there was actually fatalities during one of these big snowball
Oh,
fights,
wow.
and even broken bones. But again, it's only one account, so more research is needed for that. But it's just it must have been funny to watching these guys having a big snowball fight during this serious period. There's always that little bit of you know normality, I suppose, in a way, isn't there? It's quite cool.
Absolutely. And if Gary Gallagher presented it in one of his lectures, I'd be pretty confident that
That,
the account's out there and it happened. He's a good researcher.
it's on the American Civil War lecture series on Audible. Go and
Oh,
listen to
nice.
it. It's brilliant, honestly. I mean, I listened to it in about a week. It was that good.
Nice.
That guy really knows his stuff, don't he?
He
It's amazing.
does. I've heard him lecture, and he's one of my favorite authors. So
Oh,
yeah,
definitely.
he's got lots of good resources out there.
So overall, then, it's not really a nice place to be in the winter, is it? Winter camps, or maybe it is. I don't know because they're standing still for longer.
Right. It kind of depends. There's not as much a chance that you're going to get killed by a bullet. You might die from disease. But yeah, it kind of depends. Overall, I think soldiers would appreciate the break, if you will. We see that a little bit in their letters and their journals. Um, but a lot of them, by the time spring is coming, they are anxious to get back into campaigning, and maybe this will be the year that ends the war and things like that. Personally, I would not have wanted to do a winter in a Civil War camp. I think it would have been very cold. But with modern conveniences, modern shelter, heat, warm jackets, and things like that, winter is one of my favorite seasons to go out on a battlefield or to explore winter camps because the leaves are down, you can see a lot. Today I was out at Spotsylvania Battlefield looking at some trenches that I hadn't really had a chance to study before, and found some trenches that I hadn't seen in the summer because
I'm so jealous of you.
the leaves were so thick. So keep it in mind if you or your listeners are planning a trip. Winter can be a good time, or really early spring before the leaves come up. If you want to see earthworks and stuff like that, winter is awesome for that.
So you live in the Fredericksburg area, so you've got Spotsylvania, is it, and the wilderness, and you've got it all
Chancellorsville.
there. It's all there on your doorstep, isn't it?
It is. And it wasn't always. I grew up in Southern California where it doesn't really snow. So
Okay, yeah.
it's been
So
a
that
big
was news
weather
to you as
change.
well. Yeah.
But it's exciting to be here where there's a lot of history and be able to research it and find ways to share it in photographs and discussions like this with other people who are interested.
Cool. Anyway, Sarah, thank you so much for coming to talk to me. I
Well,
really enjoyed it.
thank you so much for inviting us.
And guys, make sure you go and support Central Virginia Battlefields Trust because they're doing such an amazing job. And there's not many of you guys, is there, doing what you're doing?
We're a local grassroots organization, so we've saved over 1,350 acres. And stay tuned on our social media, on our website. Sign up for our newsletters because we have some really exciting news that is going to break really soon. So
Ooh,
stay tuned.
spoiler alert. Thank you,
Can't
Sarah,
tell you
so
what it
much.
is, but something's coming.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much. Cheers.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye bye.